This shows that not only is a verbal agreement not enough for Russia to not invade Ukraine, but a on paper written agreement from Russia is not enough. Have any of you guys seen this article? So the reason I titled today's stream Russia Cannot Be Trusted on Ukraine is because of this article. So this article is from the New York Times, and it is, well, I think it's the New York Times, correct? Yes, the New York Times. And it is Russia is using old Ukrainian missiles against Ukraine, general says. The missiles returned to Russia in the 1990s under an agreement aimed at assuring Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity have shown up in the rubble. Now, I have a lot to say about this and what I take away from this, but I'm just going to read a bit of the article and then we'll talk about it. Shortly after a large wave of Russian missiles slammed into targets across the country in October, Ukraine's intelligence officials noticed something strange in the rubble. It was the wreckage of a K-55 subsonic cruise missile designed in the 1970s to carry a nuclear warhead. The warhead had been removed and ballast ended to disguise the fact that it was not carrying a payload, said a General Vadim, I'm just say Vadim, Ukraine's deputy intelligence chief, an assertion now backed by the Pentagon and British military intelligence. But that was not all the intelligence officials found. The missile had been built in a Ukrainian weapons factory. The missile and the bomber that most likely delivered it was part of a cache of weaponry handed over to Russia by Ukraine in the 1990s as part of an international agreement aimed at assuring Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. In November, Ukrainian forces found the remnants of two more K-55 missiles, also with their warheads removed, and part of the same tranche of weapons that Ukraine has sent to Russia under the agreement. Russia was using Ukraine's own armaments as decoys against it. They served a strategic goal. Sending up the missiles would force Ukraine to mobilize its air defense systems against them. First, the K-55 missile is launched. We react to it. It's likely a false target. After the Ukrainian air defenses are engaged, Russian bombers launch more modern missiles with destructive warheads. The three missiles are part of a larger number of retrofitted older missiles used in strikes, some as decoys and some modernized warheads. The use of old cruise missiles, including ones built in Ukraine 2 decades ago, is just one element in a complex and deadly conflict in which deception plays a role, along with fighting on the battleground. Now, this goes on right here to talk about how is in part of the 1990 Budapest Memorandum that Ukraine, Russia, and the United States all signed. Ukraine agreed to relinquish its own nuclear arsenal that it had acquired through the dissolution and dissolvement of the Soviet Union. It had the world's third largest nuclear arsenal at the time that it inherited, and that it was going to pass all of that over to Russia, and Russia was going to decommission that in return for security assurances. What were those security assurances? Well, those security assurances included no economic coercion, which Russia did in 2014 in the lead up to the Euromaidan protests, when Russia, in reaction to Ukraine deciding to, have visa-free travel with the European Union and attempting to enter the association agreement, with the majority of Ukrainians want, what Yanukovych promised he would do on the campaign trail when he was running for office in 2012, what the Europeans had agreed to and they were all ready to do. Russia decided that they were going to block all trade into Russia using economic coercion, which they promised in the Budapest Memorandum they wouldn't do. They tried to use it to push Ukraine away from signing the association agreement. Yanukovych then said, never mind, I won't sign the association agreement. He caved to the pressure and then tried to move towards a different economic arrangement with Russia. That never came to pass, though, because protesters in the Euromaidan movement then got out onto the streets. They protested against the pulling out of the association agreement because they knew that a future with Europe would be more beneficial for them. They wanted visa-free travel in Europe. They wanted the trade with Europe. They wanted the agreement with Europe. And so they went onto the street and they protested against Yanukovych for breaking his promise to sign the association agreement. Yanukovych then sent brutes out, both in the Berkut, which was the special military police, which has since been banned due to its participation in racketeering and torture. They sent out Tatushki thugs, and they brutalized protesters. This garnered a reaction as more protesters then came out onto the streets, both in the Automaidan and the Euromaidan. They stayed out there, they made medical tents, they geared up to get ready for the government's brutality, and the government proceeded to murder over 100 people who are now known as the Heavenly 100. And after negotiations collapsed, Yanukovych fled, which then led to Russia getting scared and invading Crimea, and, you know, the rest is history. But that is just one example as how Russia violating this agreement, the Budapest Memorandum, led to the instability in Ukraine that eventually evolved to this war. And that's just the economic coercion. In the Budapest Memorandum, it wasn't just economic coercion that they agreed to. They also agreed to use no means, whether diplomatic, economic pressure, whatever, or war, military conflict, force, to try to take away Ukraine's territory. That Russia would agree to respect Ukraine's territorial sovereignty and its current borders, which included Crimea and included Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, all the territory, Kharkiv, all the territory Russia tried to claim, Russia tried to take over, and Russia has, by its own laws, annexed, even if the international community doesn't recognize it. And so, the reason why I wanted to bring this up is not only is this a very physical manifestation of how Ukraine trusting Russia when it came to the Budapest Memorandum was a massive mistake. And not only because they violated it, but they're using the missiles that Ukraine handed over to be decommissioned against them in this war. Using them to pay attention to them, trick them to have air defense, get ready to take those missiles down, while they then fire other missiles to try to knock out Ukraine's electrical infrastructure, try to freeze the Ukrainians into submission. It's not going to work, but it's also very, very painful for the Ukrainian civilian population. My bigger point I want to make about this is that this shows that not only is a verbal agreement not enough for Russia to not invade Ukraine, but a on-paper written agreement from Russia is not enough to make them not invade Ukraine. Because they invaded Ukraine in 2014 and annexed Crimea. They backed rebels in the Donbass. They funneled them weapons. They put soldiers in there for the last 8 years. They engaged in economic coercion. And they've invaded at a much larger scale since 2014 on February 24th. And since then have inflicted untold devastation upon Ukraine, as its soldiers have filled up mass graves in locations like Bucha and Izium, as reports of rape have come back, in torture and brutality, and the arresting of political opposition and political prisoners. All of this is happening because, in part, this is for many reasons this is happening, but in part, Ukraine took Russia at its word, which was a mistake. Russia, when they signed the Budapest Memorandum, was at a weak point. It was right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Their economy was in shambles. Their military was in shambles. Oligarchs were taking over everything. Everything the state used to own was being bought up by the ultra-rich. Those who, those civilians who were caught up in it were feeling real pain. The Soviets just were not in a position, or now the Russians were not in a position to try to reassert their authority on all of these states that were breaking off for the Soviet Union. And so many of these states knew that even though Russia was down, Russia was not out. And so you saw states like Romania, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they ran to join NATO under this idea that, Russia's down, but they're not out. But Ukraine lagged behind. Maybe they felt safer because of the Budapest Memorandum, or maybe it was because there were politicians within Ukraine that held more sympathies towards Russia, and they felt that Russia maybe could be their friend. They believed in this idea of like Slavic unity, or the idea that, the Ukrainian people and the Russian people are they're tied, they're tied in their history and it cannot be removed. ultimately, everybody can see with foresight now that that was a mistake. And so when we talk about building a post-war Europe, of course, when you hear that, you think of World War I and World War II, but we're talking about a post-war Europe after this war, because we, of course, don't want to see any more wars in Europe. If other wars in Europe can be avoided, that'd be great, and we would like to build a society that would avoid this war from happening again. Because when I hear a lot of people call for ceasefire and call for an end to the war, it's really easy to call for a ceasefire and call for an end to the war without specific guidelines or specifics to describe how you end the war, or what does Ukraine look like after the war is over, or what does Russia look like after the war is over, what does Europe as a whole and European institutions look like after the war is over. And so when people just vaguely call for a ceasefire without specifics, I feel like a lot of times it's doing a bigger disservice than a help. And so I think one of the things that need to be discussed before a ceasefire can occur, that needs to lead into a final permanent peace agreement so we can end this cycle not only of violence but of Ukraine's subjugation to Russia, one of the things that are going to need to occur is physical security guarantees for Ukraine. Not just something verbal agreed to behind closed doors in negotiations. We've seen how that can lead to confusion around issues like Taiwan or NATO expansionism as an example. So it can't just be something verbal, and it can't just be something vaguely written down, like Russia pledges to never invade Ukraine again, because Russia has pledged not to invade Ukraine, and they did multiple times. And so obviously that isn't enough either. And so there is going to need to be something physical, a physical commitment of some capacity to Ukraine in the face of another future Russian invasion. Because if Russia had planned this differently, I don't necessarily think they would have taken all of Ukraine, but I think that they could have had better performance if they planned for more than a week of fighting and they had food and fuel at the start. Maybe they could have done better. If they more dealt with this issue of corruption in the Russian military and didn't have all their equipment being sold out of the back of cars and having 1.5 million winter uniforms just disappearing like that, maybe they could have dealt with this differently. Maybe if they mobilized sooner, they could have dealt with this differently. Maybe if they didn't underestimate the Ukrainians, they could have dealt with this differently. But that's an alternate reality. But if they were to, have a future war, they would obviously try to address all the issues that led to them having so many problems. And so the best thing to do isn't to necessarily even just prepare for that future war that could happen once this war's over, but to try to make it impossible to happen in the first place. And when I look at all the post-Soviet states that haven't been invaded, the ones that are weaker than Ukraine that haven't been invaded, that if you were to listen to Vladimir Putin go on and on and on and on and on and on about his ideological reasons, his historical reasons for invading Ukraine, that those same reasons, like, oh, these are post-Soviet states that have like large Russian-speaking populations, and they're artificial states created by Lenin. Like, this is stuff that could apply to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, countries that actually have a decently sized Russian-speaking population, but a generally weaker military than Ukraine. So why is it that Vladimir Putin is invading Ukraine, but not invading Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania? The reason's quite simple. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are within NATO, a defensive alliance, a defensive group of countries that have come together, a military alliance that has Article 5 in its charter. Article 5 stating that if any NATO nation is attacked, all the other NATO nations have to come and be their homies and fight for them. Not the exact wording, but that's my wording. And so Ukraine doesn't have any of those dedicated homies. They don't. And so what they need is some dedicated homies. Now, most people talk about now NATO membership for Ukraine, and NATO membership for Ukraine has been discussed for a very long period of time. But let's be for real, NATO membership for Ukraine is far from guaranteed, even if 83% of Ukrainians, according to a recent poll, favor NATO membership. And so Hungary and Turkey agreeing to Ukraine joining NATO, when you need every single NATO member state to agree, for a nation state to join. I find that very difficult. Hungary, because they're highly reliant on Russian influence, is just one example. They're highly reliant on Russian gas, and Viktor Orban is a lot more friendly towards Vladimir Putin than a lot of his European counterparts. And that's not even opening up the Turkey or possibly any of the other states that could have a problem with this. But that doesn't mean, even if the goal of having Ukraine as part of NATO that Ukrainians want and that many NATO member states want, even if that can't be achieved, there can still be other arrangements written up, say a defensive pact with the United States. The United States declaring that if Ukraine is invaded in the future, it'll be treated like if the Philippines gets invaded. If the Philippines was invaded tomorrow, the United States has a defensive pact with them, meaning we would have to come to their defense. You've probably never heard of it, which also means that to some extent it's probably successful in stopping anybody from wanting to invade the Philippines, because nobody wants to fight the United States. And so if we got the United States to agree to a defensive pact with Ukraine, as well as possibly the UK, maybe France, Poland, I think probably a lot of Eastern European states that have a history with Russian colonialism, their people would generally be in favor of signing on to such an arrangement. That could dissuade a Russian invasion until Ukraine is able to integrate itself with wider European security structures and the EU as a whole. And so I just wanted to talk about how, if we're going to try to avoid stuff like this, Ukraine's own materials that it agreed to give up being used against it in a war of aggression, a war of annexation, a war of cultural annihilation, if we're going to have Ukraine agree to a ceasefire and a peace deal whenever, it could be a year from now, it could be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or it could be a week from now. Who knows when exactly this war is going to end? But when it does end, we need to make sure that it is the final end. And the only way we do that is if we integrate Ukraine within European security structures. That is the only way. Because without that, what we could be doing, and many Ukrainians fears, Zelensky fears, everybody I've talked to fears, is that we're kicking this can down the road until Russia is in another better position to invade Ukraine, and Ukraine could be in a weaker position. Because this is the best shot Ukraine is ever going to get at fighting Russia. When it has the whole international attention, Russia didn't have a good plan going into it. They underestimated their opponent. Ukraine's got the momentum. This is the best shot, and they don't want to give it up. But if another war was to happen, odds are Russia would go into it much more prepared. So once this war is over, and Ukraine's won, or some settlements reached, or whatever happens, no matter what, they have to be integrated within some security structure. Because if they're not, then we have zero physical guarantees outside of verbal commitments that Russia won't invade them again. The Russians, I mean, if we're gonna put it bluntly, and like I'm Theodore Roosevelt in some old-timey movie, the Russians respect strength when it comes to this. And so if there's no real strength behind these promises of support, and strength behind these disincentives to stop Russia from invading again, then the Russians just might up calling Ukraine in the West bluff. And so, no matter what happens when it comes to negotiating these peace deals, we got to make sure we have arrangements for Ukraine to stop Russia from invading in the future. We cannot just have it be a bygones be bygones peace deal. We need a peace deal for a sustainable future that includes Ukraine with the rest of the world developing, thriving, and not being bombed. What do you guys think? Do you guys agree with me, or do you guys disagree with me? I think it's a pretty unobjectionable take at this point, right? Like, you cannot, I know some people talk about like Ukrainian neutrality, but it is impossible. Like, Ukraine has tried that route, and we saw how it went. And it seems like only the states that explicitly was like, we're not gonna be neutral, those seem to be the only states that aren't being invaded by Russia. Need security guarantees for this to end. Amen. Amen. Literally no history in the past 30 years where the Russians held to their word. Well, I mean, I'm sure I could find some agreements where they did. But I think if you don't trust somebody, like, you don't make it so it's not the trust that you have faith in, but it's the forces at play that you have faith in. Not that you trust the Russians, but that you trust the idea that they wouldn't be so stupid as to fight with all of the United States. If they can't take Russia and if they can't take Ukraine in its current form, there's no amount of jostling and changing of the military power in Russia that could lead to it fighting all of the transatlantic alliance and winning. So if we integrate, or even like parts of the transatlantic alliance, so if Ukraine is integrated into these European security structures, there's really nothing the Russian clowns can do.